Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's mock class on war. Why is it fought and when is it legal? My name is Scott Taylor. I teach international relations here at Syracuse University, among many other things. I've been here about 6 years now. Prior to that, I spent 20 years in the United States Army, including several years as an assistant professor on the faculty at West Point. I also taught joint and operational planning at the Joint Forces Staff College, and now I work here at Syracuse University. I'd like to thank you all for taking time out of your evening to join us. If you have questions during my talk, please feel free to just drop them in the chat or hold them until the end. I have a bit of a unique perspective. Not only do I work here at Syracuse University, I am a graduate of the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, where I have my joint degree in public administration and international relations. And I'm also a Syracuse father. My daughter is about halfway through her second year now. She's getting ready to start finals in just under 2 weeks. So I do have a pretty unique perspective on life here at Syracuse University. So tonight, as I said, we are going to talk about war. Maybe not the most lighthearted topic or the most fun topic for us to talk about, but it's an important topic. And how would this fit into a larger course at Syracuse University, particularly an international relations course? Well, normally this would be 2 or 3 lessons in the course that I currently teach on international relations, because we would be talking about elements and instruments of national power. We'd be talking about international relations theory and how different theories explain why states or countries, in international relations we refer to them as states, how states pursue their vital national interests. And going to war or using military force, which is an element and an instrument of national power, is how some states choose to pursue their interests. So let's go ahead and get started. So what we're going to talk about, we'll briefly talk about why we want to study war, what war is, how are they fought, when is it legal to go to war, and then what actions are legal or illegal in the conduct of war. So why do we study war? Going all the way back to the 4th century Roman philosopher Vegetius, known as Publius Vegetius Renatus. We study war to prepare. If we want peace, we prepare for war. So we study war not necessarily in the hopes of we're going to go to war or we're going to launch war to achieve our interests, but to be prepared in case there is war. Because to be caught unprepared can be a disaster for a country. And that's even more relevant today when states can deploy military forces faster than any other time throughout history. So again, you want to understand not necessarily the arrangement of forces on the battlefield. That's not really what we're going to talk about tonight, but the deep strategic thought about why would a state choose to commit military forces to achieve their national interest. Perhaps one of the most famous writers on war, Sun Tzu, talks about how war is of vast importance to the state. And if you think about if a state were to go to war unprepared or to make a poor choice or lack of judgment in using military power to achieve their interests, it can actually alter the existence of the state. States can survive economic catastrophe, they can survive a loss of influence, they can survive many, many things. But loss in war can be devastating to a country's existence. Think about World War I, the collapse of empires across Europe in the early 20th century. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, which really kind of started all of World War I, ceased to exist at the end of the war. Germany, Imperial Germany, the character of the state and nature of the state changed so much that it gave rise to Hitler and the Nazi Party 20 years later. So Germany completely changed. Even nominal victors like Russia, Imperial Russia ceased to exist because of a revolution that occurred due to the losses in military personnel that were incurred during the war. So those catastrophic losses led to the Red Revolution. The Russian Empire ceased to exist and became the Soviet Union. Today, if Russia is successful in maintaining control of portions of Eastern Ukraine, the existence of Ukraine as a state will be vitally altered. We also study war because it's important. Not just the military, the military shouldn't be the only group of individuals studying war. It's important to study war from a civilian perspective. I always like to use the example of the President of the United States. The President of the United States, as Harry Truman once said, the buck stops here. They're the ultimate decision maker. But where does the president get their information from? Well, they get it from their advisors. And if we aren't studying war and conflict, how are we going to make relevant or useful judgments and recommendations to decision makers? Part of our, the reason here in the United States, we've kind of abandoned the study of war, I feel, maybe in the last 20 or 30 years. Part of it has always been our geography. Unlike Europe or Asia, we don't share borders with several other countries that maybe, choose to invade us or view us as weaker or things like that. Except for brief conflicts with Mexico in the early 20th century and late 19th century, we aren't surrounded by expansionist neighbors that are looking to conquer the United States. Part of the reason we don't study war is our own culture. We believe that wars of aggression are not acceptable. So we really believe that wars to us are defensive in nature, that to protect our interests or to protect the interests of our allies, not necessarily go out and expand our interests into other countries. And then finally, having a smaller population that is directly involved in the military, that sometimes does make it easier to commit military force, but it doesn't necessarily mean we're going to commit those forces. But when we do, there are far fewer people in our society that are now involved. A good example is about currently 17% of members of the House of Representatives and 17% of the Senate are military veterans. 50 years ago, 75% of the government, the House of Representatives in particular, were military veterans, and 81% of the members of the Senate were former members of the military. So that kind of changes the calculus when making a decision about, does a state want to go to war? It's much easier sometimes when a state doesn't have a large portion of veterans who can kind of advise political leaders about whether they want to go to war or not. But it also sometimes makes it easier when you have an all-volunteer force as well. So it's important to study why we would go to war and what we hope to accomplish by going to war. So what is war? That's really the main focus of tonight. We're talking about interstate war, the war between two countries. That is really the main focus of international relations scholars. Interstate war is easy to define because we know what constitutes a state. There are agreed upon attributes that define a country: a border, a stable population, a government, and it's recognized by other members of the international community. So we know what a state is, and we know when a state fights another state. It's very easy for us to assess them. International relations scholars currently define war as 1,000 battle deaths within a calendar year, and that's both combatants and non-combatants. So members of the uniformed military and civilians count in that death toll. But increases in medical technology have made death less likely in many instances in war. So wars become more violent but less deadly. So sometimes you can have a conflict that doesn't even achieve the 1,000 battle deaths in a year, but it still may be very devastating to the state. The quote here from Clausewitz is perhaps from the most important study or most important book on the study of war. Clausewitz places war in the larger context of politics, and really he says war is nothing but a duel on a larger scale. We always have to tie war to a political purpose, and the purpose of that is usually to compel our enemies to do what we want them to do. Whether we want them to take or not take a certain action, behave or not behave in a certain way, provide territory or resources to the victorious side. But really, that's the whole point. It's to achieve a political end, whatever that political end is, which is decided by, in the United States here, by our political leadership. Now, states don't always necessarily have to resort to war to achieve their national interests. They can compel or deter an adversary without actually committing military force. But the threat of war may be enough in some instances to cause states to change their behavior or take a particular course of action. Muammar Gaddafi, after seeing what happened to Saddam Hussein in 2003, 2004 in Iraq, he was indirectly compelled to abandon his weapons of mass destruction ambitions out of fear of being invaded by the United States. Conversely, Russia was not deterred by NATO in this past spring when it chose to invade Ukraine. Russia may have viewed NATO as having the capability to inflict military harm on it, but it lacked the political will or the reason or the want to do so. So Russia felt it could get away with using military force to achieve its objectives in Ukraine because it didn't have anyone that was going to stop it from doing so. But war is always tied to political ends. And it's just really one of the instruments of national power. So if it's not tied to a political end, then there's really no purpose behind war. And once wars have begun, they're very difficult to control because much of war is left to uncertainty and chance. As my old boss used to say, the enemy gets a vote. So even though you take an action with the greatest intentions in mind, things may not turn out the way you want them to. So you always have to think about planning for war. What are the possible outcomes, and how do we make sure we don't go down a path that we're not going to be able to recover from? Now, when we think about war, there are three characteristics of war. War is different from other types of violence, like riots or political protests or genocide or things like that. Although those are very violent, but they are not considered war because war has three characteristics, like I said. First, it's an organized, deliberate violence declared by a competent authority. War is the purview of state government and is conducted by militaries that conform to the laws and customs of war. As an activity, war is more lethal than other forms of violence that I mentioned. And it's because it's an organized form of violence, and it helps increase its lethality. And finally, both sides must have a real, but not necessarily equal capacity. If you think about using the military to attack innocent civilians within a country, that's not necessarily war because the two sides have not real capacity. The unarmed civilians have no way to stand up against the armed military. Conflicts where one side has absolutely no power, they aren't considered war. They might be considered war crimes for killing innocent civilians, but in international relations theory, international relations scholarship, those aren't considered wars. So we're going to focus tonight mostly on the reactions between two states. So why are wars fought? Wars are fought for many reasons. Thomas Hobbes, writing after the English Civil War in the 1600s, his famous book, The Leviathan, he says there are really three reasons that states go to war. First is they go to war for competition. Men fight because they desire resources such as territory, minerals, oil, things like that. Men fight for diffidence. They worry about being attacked by their enemies. So you fight on terms that are favorable to you because that anxiety that's caused by always feeling threatened makes you want to strike first before your enemy strikes you. This leads to preemptive wars or preventative wars. A preventative war is like 1981, the attack on Iraq's nuclear reactor by the Israelis. That would be a preventative war, prevented the Iraqis from building a nuclear reactor, thus using nuclear weapons against the Israelis. A preemptive war might be the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. The United States felt that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and was going to use them, so the United States conducted a war to relieve Saddam Hussein of those weapons. Finally, men fight for glory. Man is simply quarrelsome by nature, so they seek war to gain reputation. It's really less common today than the other two reasons are, but throughout history, men have simply fought because they felt it was a way to make a reputation and a name for themselves. In the international relations theory known as offensive realism, say that states fight because they want to show that they're willing to use force to attain their objectives. So whether those objectives could be anything, but they're willing to show force. That means that they will use military force to achieve their objectives, which if they try to achieve an objective in the future, other states may realize it's not worth going to war and kind of acquiesce to their demands. There are practical reasons states go to war, right? We talked about economic and territorial gains or political alliances even. In 1914, Britain went to war with Germany because Germany violated Belgium's neutrality. And Britain had a treaty with Belgium guaranteeing their neutrality from German invasion. So the British really had no chance or no choice but to go to war. Once the Germans invaded through Belgium, the British had to uphold their end of the treaty. So there are a lot of reasons why we go to war. We can talk about when is it legal to go to war. Roman historian Titus Livius says, for those it is just necessary, it is just. Well, that's not necessarily so. We're going to talk about two theories today. We're going to talk about jus ad bellum, when is it legal to go to war, or jus in bello, what is justice in war? What are actions that are legal in war? First, we're going to talk about the just war theory. When is it legal to go to war? And it's, we talked about Titus Livius here. He says, for those whom war is necessary, it is just. Well, that's not necessarily true. You think about the German invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1938 and 1939. The Germans felt they needed more, what they called Lebensraum, living space for the growing German population. So to them, the war was necessary. But that doesn't make it just. We take it today to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Russia feels it's in their national interest that it's necessary for them to expand their sphere of influence in the near abroad. So they want to invade Ukraine to prevent NATO from gaining, or Western Europe from gaining, a foothold in Ukraine, thus threatening Russia's borders. That's how Russia views it. Doesn't necessarily mean that the war is correct or Russia is right in doing so, but that's how they view it. So really, there are other reasons and principles that we look to when we're deciding to go to war. Oh, there we go. So French philosopher Montesquieu says there are really two cases in which war is just: to resist the aggression of an enemy, and second, in order to help an ally who has been attacked. So the Ukrainians are justified in going to war against the Russians because they're resisting the aggression of an enemy. There are 5 principles of just war theory, or when is it legal to wage war. Well, admitting more people from the waiting room. So there, like I said, 5 principles. First one is there's a just cause. Wars can either be fought, as Montesquieu says, in self-defense or in the defense of others. That alleviates the burden of having to prove that a war is just. If you've been attacked, you have the right to self-defense. Second, war must be declared by a competent authority. Here in the United States, there's tension between the executive branch, where the president has the constitutional responsibility as commander-in-chief, and the legislative branch, which has the constitutional authority to declare war in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. This principle has largely been ignored in recent history, both here in the United States and abroad. Russia did not declare war on Ukraine. Russia simply announced that it was conducting a special military action and invaded Ukraine. Even here in the United States, we don't really declare war anymore. The last time we declared war was in 1941 against the Germans, after we were attacked by the Japanese and the Germans declared war on the United States. We generally tend to get a resolution, such as the authorization for the use of military force that was passed by Congress after September 11th, granting the power to the president to use military force as he saw fit to punish those that were responsible for the terrorist attacks of September 11th. The third factor that is responsible in just war theory is proportionality. Now, proportionality can mean a lot of different things, but it means if you're going to conduct war, the conduct of the war must not be excessive and cause unnecessary suffering in proportion to the military objective. Now, that's very difficult and very subjective when you think about it. What I think is excessive may not be excessive to somebody else. In the United States, we have what's known as the Powell-Weinberger doctrine, which is we will use overwhelming force to achieve our objectives. That's because we want to minimize the number of U.S. casualties that we suffer. We don't intentionally target civilians or anything like that, but we do use overwhelming military force against our enemies, which you could sometimes argue would violate the tenet of proportionality in just war theory. The fourth tenet of just war theory is a chance of success. Interests in military objectives must be clearly defined before the war commences, and the military must be clearly capable of achieving those objectives. Because if they're not, then there's a very limited chance for success. It's the wrong tool to fix the problem. We talked about their instruments of national power. Well, there's several of them. Military is one of them. Diplomatic power is one of them. Economic power is one of them. Informational power. Can you convince your adversary to do something without actually using military force? Sometimes we talk about the use of soft power, convincing your enemy without them really even realizing it to do something you'd like them to do. And then finally, the fifth tenet of just war theory is last resort. War should be tied to political objectives to serve a national interest, but it should be the absolute last thing a state decides to do before launching war. It should be really the tool of last resort, and all other elements of power and instruments of power should be exhausted before war is decided upon. So once we've decided it's legal for us to go to war, what actions in war are legal? Well, John Henry Cardinal Newman, British religious figure, says that there's legitimate war and our actions more legitimate. War is necessary, so it must be conducted in such a way that it minimizes the damages caused and the suffering to combatants and non-combatants. Just war theory is also often referred to as the rules of war or international humanitarian law. And when you violate these types of rules, you become known as a war criminal. In the Russia-Ukraine conflict, Russia has been accused of violating the rules of war in its conduct of the war in Ukraine. They've attacked civilians, they've attacked schools, churches, and other non-military targets. They've also been accused of torturing and dismembering captured Ukrainian soldiers. Now, Ukrainians have also been accused of doing some of these same things to Russian soldiers. So both sides maybe have violated the laws of war. A lot of times in my class, we'll talk about what happens when you violate the laws of war. At the end, if this conflict were to end, you could, conceivably prosecute someone like a Vladimir Putin in the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. However, you have to be able to capture him first. That would be a very difficult thing to do. The last time, we've really done this is in the 1990s with the Bosnian Civil War, as well as some of the genocides that were committed in Africa. They were brought before the International Criminal Court in The Hague and tried for violating crimes against humanity. Much like the tenets of just war theory about when is it legal to go to war, there are several principles that are that guide how we conduct ourselves in war. The first is military necessity. You can only attack targets that are military targets and that are directly related to the objectives and are military in nature. That's why we don't attack hospitals. You shouldn't attack schools. You shouldn't attack, civilian concentrations and things like that. Second is you should also spare non-combatants and defenseless persons. Civilians on the battlefield should be protected. And in just war theory, there's a way to tell between civilians and military combatants. Military combatants have to wear a uniform that is identifiable at a distance. They have to carry their arms openly, and they have to adhere to the laws of war. So civilians that aren't doing those things are not considered combatants. Now, some civilians do engage in conflict. Civilians in Ukraine, for a good example, have stood up their own civil defense forces. They're subject to the laws of war then. It's known as a levée en masse. When you take large portions of the civilian population and put them under arms to repel an invader, even though they're not in an official military capacity, the Ukrainian military, they are subject to the laws of war and should be treated as such if they violate them, but also are offered some of the protections. If they're captured, they should be treated as prisoners of war. They shouldn't be subject to undue punishment or harm. Those who surrender on the battlefield are no longer considered combatants. So they then should be spared military targeting. Interesting though, it's not a violation of the law of war to shoot a paratrooper. If that he or she is jumping out of an airplane to conduct an attack, they are a legal target while they're in the air. But the pilot of flying that airplane, if it's shot down after it has distributed its paratroopers, and that pilot has to jump out of his or her aircraft, they are not a target because their weapon was the airplane. And once the airplane has become unusable, they're no longer considered a combatant. Whereas a paratrooper, the whole purpose of their jumping out of an airplane is to conduct combat operations. So two people in a very similar situation, but their roles are completely different, means they have to be treated differently under the laws of war. The third principle of just war and how we conduct ourselves in war is proportion of means. The amount of force should be proportional to the objective trying to be achieved. So a good example is if the enemy is occupying a specific block of a city. You don't destroy the entire city to achieve your military objectives. You limit your attacks to that portion which is being held by the enemy military. And then finally, the last principle of just war theory or the laws of war is no indiscriminate or needless suffering. The ban of use on weapons that causes a person to suffer or needlessly blinds them or maims them or cause unnecessary suffering. So things like landmines, cluster bombs, poison gas, bullets that explode when they hit the body, bullets that are made of non-metal materials that are not, you can't use an X-ray to find them. Those are considered things that are cause indiscriminate and needless suffering. Now, that being said, not all countries have signed on to things like the landmine treaty. The United States, as a policy, has not signed on to that landmine treaty, but we don't use landmines as part of our military operations. Same with the ban on cluster munitions. The United States maintains the right, if we see fit, to use those cluster munitions, but we don't use them as part of our general everyday military operations. The conduct of war is codified by the Geneva Conventions. And those, if you violate the rules of war, you risk becoming a war criminal. So militaries train on the use of the rules of war in order to train their military members so they don't violate them. Because, while war is terrible and horrible, it's unfortunately going to be with us for a long time. And it's the conduct of that war that, we want it to be, you can't have a just peace if you don't fight a just war, as the old saying goes. You don't want to cause undue suffering. If you can't, at the end of the war, look at yourself and say you did the best you could, it's very difficult to, to kind of carry on with that. Unfortunately, as we get ready to wrap up here, so we talked about 30 minutes, so we're about there, war is likely to be with us for a long time. We started with a 4th century Roman philosopher, we're going to end with a Greek philosopher, that only the dead have seen the end of war. States will choose to go to war as long as they see it as a means to achieve their national interests. Whether those national interests be expansionist in nature like the Russians, or to protect themselves as the United States did in the invasion of Afghanistan after 2001. War is not going to end when it's viewed as a way to achieve those interests. So kind of wrap it up here, and like I said, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about anything about Syracuse University. War isn't something that states should take lightly. We've seen the outcome of war can vastly alter the nature of a country. Think about the years after World War I, several empires that were involved in the war completely collapsed, changing the nature of the state. Wars are fought for various reasons. They can pretty much be boiled down to several: competition for resources, fear of being attacked, and just the achievement of glory. war can be legal, and how it is fought has legal ramifications. And it's important to remember those things when war is being conducted to achieve national interest. And finally, war is likely to be with us forever. So I'm going to unshare my screen here in a moment. There is my email address. It's jstayl02@syr.edu. And there's my phone number. I'd be happy to answer any questions. If not tonight, you can always send me an email or call me, and I'd be happy to answer. So I'm going to stop sharing. Like I said, I encourage you to unmute your cameras if you want. And I'd be happy, like I said, happy. We have a few in the chat. No one can justly initiate a war. Well, yeah, so you can justly initiate a war. Not necessarily because you say a war is just. Is it just? You have to follow the rules of war. When determining if going to war is to achieve your national interests. I see someone mentions Putin technically had his own justification, but who defines what is just? And that's a very good question. At the end, if Putin is unsuccessful, his war is going to be judged as unjust. If Putin's successful, or at least managed to maintain power in Russia at the end of the war, it's going to be very difficult to prosecute him for any sort of war crimes that he's been involved in. So what other questions? What questions do you have about anything against, okay, Samantha, I see, go ahead and ask your question.
Can you hear me?
Yep, hear you great.
Okay, so this isn't related to the topic, but
Okay.
I was going to ask what classes you suggest freshmen take if they are an undeclared major.
Okay. So when you get here, there's going to be at least two classes you're going to have to take. You're going to have to take first year seminar, and you're going to have to take Writing 105, unless you've taken AP Writing or you've taken dual college enrollment, right? So you may pass out of Writing. I would kind of think, where do you see yourself going in 4 years, which is very difficult. It's so hard to ask someone coming to college at 18 years old what they want to do 4 years from now, or 5, 10 years from now. So take a broad swath of classes. Take an introductory class if you think you want to go into the College of Arts and Sciences or something like that. Take one other introductory level. Take the Introduction to International Relations class. Take the Introduction to Public Policy class, PAF 101. Take Introduction to American Government. Some of those classes, the reason they're even useful, even if you decide you never want to go, you take Introduction to American Government, decide you never want to be a political science major, it will at least give you a really good understanding of the American political system. If you're undecided in engineering, take you'll take Engineering 107, which is the Introduction to Engineering. But I would take a broad swath of classes. I would take, find things that interest you. There are going to be a few classes you have to take. You're going to have to knock out science requirements and, write your writing requirement. You're going to have to knock out a humanities requirement. You're going to have to knock out, as part of first year seminar, usually in your second semester or third semester, you're going to take a diversity, equity, and inclusion class. So take a broad swath. With the exception of 1 or 2 majors, you're going to have plenty of opportunity to take electives. So even if you take a bunch of random classes your first semester, they're probably going to count towards your degree. So next question, Mattingly, I see your hand is up.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, my question was, my major isn't really directed towards like this class, I would say, but I felt it was really interesting and was considering taking a class like it just because. And my question in regards to what you were talking about is, does your class kind of touch on any war alternatives, like in what your class or what you believe are any war alternatives?
Yeah, so what's your major first?
I early decision to Whitman, and my second choice is in Maxwell. It's sociology.
Okay. So then I have a ton of Whitman students in my class so it will depend on the international relations professor. The way I structure my class is part of it's my background, part of it's my view on how I view international relations. Is we do talk a lot about conflict, but the classes on war, there's really only 2. We spend a whole class on just war theory and a whole class on what is war and how is war fought. We also spend time talking about human rights. We spend a time talking about international cooperation. We spend a whole class talking about decision making. Plus the international relations theories class, we talk about nuclear war, we talk about terrorism, we talk about global trade and the economy. So even for a business major, it's really good because you understand international relations just isn't about war. It's about the interaction among states of the world and how they get on. And everybody acts in their interest. Nobody makes a decision that is not in their best interest. And yes, sometimes we trade short-term, gains for long-term gains. So maybe a short-term interest, maybe a short-term gain isn't in your best interest, but I know long-term it will be better for me. So even a business major, you're going to learn about how states do things to achieve interest, or how individuals do things to achieve their interests. So we talk about a lot more than just war. Definitely. Katie, I see your hands up.
Hello.
Hello.
I have a question,
Mhm.
and it is, so in your interpretation of just war, do you have an example of a war that you think was conducted justly, and why do you think it was?
Wow, that's a hard question.
Sorry.
No, that's good. So when I guess the war that stands out in most people's minds is World War II. But then I can also turn that on its head and say the United States firebombed Dresden, Germany, and Tokyo, Japan, killing tens of thousands of civilians. And people, I bring it up in class specifically, and I always get why weren't we treated as war criminals? Well, because A, we won, but B, international relations and just war theory and human rights law didn't really start taking effect until the 1940s. So World War II, in terms of the defensive, the United States, Great Britain, France, was just in the sense that we were fighting off aggression. You could even say the United States' choice to use combat forces in Afghanistan in September and October of 2001 is just because we were attacked. Now, we didn't talk a lot tonight about insurgencies or using military force against non-state actors like terrorist groups, but the military is still held to the just war concepts, even in wars like that. So it's very, so my students struggle with this in terms of it's not black or white. Had the United States lost World War II, you would have seen the opposite of the Nuremberg trials. You possibly would have seen some of the U.S. Air Force leadership in the Pacific, or U.S. Air Force leadership in Europe held, to the same trials that were held against the Germans and the Japanese, because things that they had done were considered, by today's standard. That's the other problem. We always view the past through today's lens, which isn't necessarily always a good thing to do. So the concept of just and unjust is very gray, but I always go back to World War II as maybe one of the examples that, was a very just war because we were attacked. It's a long answer to a question that actually was very thought-provoking.
Thank you, and thank you,
Sure.
you for your answer. That was very interesting to me. Thank you.
Thank you again. Thank you all for coming tonight. This is, I could talk about international relations and things like that forever. So, but I see Henry, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question. So there's this notion that since the Vietnam War, there's been an increasing gap between the civilians and the combatants, because we just need a very small armed force to go into war, and everyone just stays behind. And I think you touched upon it when talking about the US. So do you think this is a problem that should be addressed? And if so, how can we change it?
Yes, Dan, thank you. I touched on it very briefly. So about 7% of the US population is a military veteran. It has gone significantly down, obviously, because as you mentioned, right after the Vietnam conflict, the United States transitioned to an all-volunteer force. So a lot of scholars and a lot of people say it's much easier to commit military force when you don't know somebody directly involved. 50, 60 years ago, you likely knew several people that were either veterans or currently serving in the military. Today, that's far less likely. So it's much easier, some people would say, to commit that force. How do we fix that? It's a really good question. And I don't know if I would not advocate for the draft. I would not advocate that everyone should serve in the military. I think everyone should serve the country and their community in the way that they see is most appropriate to them and how they feel comfortable doing it. So I don't think we're going to fix that problem by making more people join the military. I think the way we fix that problem is, like I said, in the United States, academically, we have abandoned the study of war, not the arrangement of forces on the battlefield. That's the purview of the military. But we have largely abandoned the study of war in terms of how are wars initiated? How are they conducted to achieve interest? And how are they terminated? Right? How do we end that? Even we struggle with that. How does a war end? It's easy to get into the war, but how do you end it? Montesquieu said in the quote that I had, you can't fight a war that annihilates all of humanity. You achieve your interest. How do you then end the war? So I think that's one way we can, kind of get around this. Madeleine Albright once famously said to Colin Powell, "What's the purpose of having this grand military if you're never going to use it?" So we can't just use it to do everything. But one way to help ameliorate some of this kind of tendency, we'll have the military do it, is to have these conversations and have more people involved and to study it. Because the military is not the only tool that the United States has, and we do a very good job of using our other instruments of national power. But just having these conversations, I think, is a way to get people to understand, why would we go to war? How do we conduct war? How do we get out of wars? Hope, I see your hands up. Go ahead, please.
Hi, sorry. I just had a question concerning the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in China with Taiwan, because if China does attack Taiwan and then we obviously have to go defend Taiwan, would China then try and rely on Russia to help them, and then would that sort of lead to a larger scale battle, would you think?
So that's the fear of a lot of people, is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has emboldened the Chinese to invade Taiwan. And there are some similarities in the sense that Russia views Ukraine, particularly the Crimea and the Eastern Oblast, as part of Russia proper. And if you know anything about Chinese history, the Chinese view Taiwan as part of mainland China, as part of the greater China, because that's where, after the Chinese Civil War in the 1940s, the nationalist government fled to what was then known as Formosa. China, after the Chinese Civil War, the Chinese communists consolidated on mainland China. They've always viewed it as kind of an unresolved issue. If China were to invade Taiwan, that could really prove difficult for the United States. I think it would prove difficult for the Chinese as well. But does it lead to a broader conflict? That's very possible. The United States has been very ambiguous on Taiwan for a very long time, which I think is strategically smart. President Biden did say earlier this year, that the United States would defend Taiwan, and I think we would find it very difficult to not defend Taiwan. But also, is it in our interest to go to war directly with China? And if China has kind of stayed out of the Ukraine issue. They aren't openly supporting the Russians or anything, providing arms. The Iranians have been openly providing some of their drone technology to the Russians. North Koreans have provided, weapons and munitions to the Russians. But if the war were to expand and China were to invade Taiwan and they needed Russia's help, I don't know if the Russians have any ability to help them right now. The Russians are having a real hard go of it in Ukraine. And what will be interesting to see now is, do the Russians, and this is actually I'm going to talk about in my class on Monday with my students. So I've got the map of how the Russian forces are arrayed right now. The Russians are not in the greatest position, but they're also not in a terribly weak position. They've arrayed their forces defensively right now, which allows them to hopefully hold on, from their perspective, hopefully hold on to the eastern portions of Ukraine, to include the Crimea, which Russia views as part of Russia proper. So can they break the NATO alliance? Can they break the European Union alliance by just sitting pat for the winter? As it gets colder and darker in Europe, are the European citizens willing to continue to support Ukraine when their own people are starving and freezing? So that's going to be very interesting. But I think if the war were to expand, if China were to invade Taiwan, Russia, I don't know if Russia would be able to help them very much. And I just saw somebody put in chat, is it really in our strategic, we get so much from China, would a war with China be, it would hurt both us and the Chinese. So is it in China's interest to go to war over Taiwan? That's a difficult, if I could answer that question, I'd probably be a millionaire or more. But, I personally don't see any reason that the Chinese would want to invade Taiwan. It would be an amphibious assault. It'd be very difficult. And it would completely upset the global economy, more than we could ever even imagine. William, go ahead, please.
So I kind of just had a question. So at the start, when we saw Russia amassing forces on Ukraine with its border with Ukraine, do you think that if we like amassed troops in the Baltic states, that could have potentially deterred Russia? Like, do you think that if we maybe increased our troop presence in Eastern Europe and kind of showed the Russians that we were willing to like go toe to toe, if that's what they wanted, do you think that could have potentially stopped them from invading Ukraine, or would they just go through with it?
So a game of strategic chicken. So, right, that's really what the Cold War was, a game of strategic chicken. We had so many forces in Europe that we dared the Russians to invade Western Europe, and they didn't. They stayed on their side of the Iron Curtain. We stayed on our side of the Iron Curtain. Things played well. I don't know, because I wonder if Putin's assessment of the West was that we're weak, that we are not willing to go to war with the Russians to fight over Ukraine. And it's different if, are we willing to go to war over Poland, or are we willing to go to war over Germany or the Czech Republic or some of these other European states that are part of NATO? Because Ukraine was not part of NATO. So I think even if we had amassed a larger body of troops, Putin probably still would have gone forward with his invasion, because he doesn't think we would have stood up to him. He sees the withdrawal from Afghanistan as the U.S. not having any more appetite for conflict. And if you think about historically, we've gone in waves. After World War II, we kind of tried to retreat into our own borders, but Korea happened, and President Truman decided we're going to commit troops to Korea in 1950, not because it was in U.S.'s interest, but because it was in our interest to prop up the United Nations. And if the United Nations failed, if the U.S. doesn't get involved in Korea in 1950 and North Korea overruns the entire peninsula, it makes the United Nations pointless. Because the United Nations was designed to prevent things like from conflict from happening, much like the League of Nations after World War I. But after Korea, we kind of go into less of a slight lull because of the Cold War. But even if you think about after Vietnam, there's a very long lull before you don't want to get involved militarily anymore. After Desert Storm in early 1990, we kind of don't get really involved. We get involved in some small wars around the world. But then we've been involved in Afghanistan now for 20 years, by the time we withdrew. So Putin viewed it as it's a time where the United States is not interested in getting involved in conflict. So I think even if we had amassed troops in Europe, Putin probably still would have tried to invade Ukraine, because he thinks we wouldn't have wanted to. It's not in our interest to respond in a military way. Eliza, go ahead, please.
Hi, I have a question about your idea from a military and political standpoint rather than an educational standpoint. What is your opinion on the U.S. sending more and more troops to Europe, places like Germany, Poland? Do you think that's not a bad omen, but like a foreshadow to what could happen with the U.S. in involving themselves with more people rather than more equipment in the Ukraine-Russia war?
I don't see us sending troops into Ukraine. I could be wrong. But I don't see us getting involved in a shooting war with the Russians over Ukraine. At best, I see us continuing to supply them with arms, advanced arms and munitions, which in a way is, it's safer for us in terms of, the Russians know we're giving the Ukrainians weapons. It's not a secret. It's out there for everyone to know. And the Russians seem okay with that. What I'm going to find interesting today is there was a bomb that went off in the Ukrainian embassy, and I think it was in Madrid. It was in Spain. I think it was pretty sure it was Madrid. So that has all the earmarks of Putin. If you think about Putin's history of assassinating his political enemies across the globe, he's done it in Britain, he's done it at home in Russia and a few places like that. Is he going to expand the war in an asymmetric means like that, using, setting off a bomb to kill an opposition leader somewhere, or to damage a Ukrainian diplomat somewhere in another part of the world? I don't know if us putting more troops into Europe necessarily means we're going to get involved in their, in Ukraine. But I do think it is meant to show that we are committed to defending Western Europe, but treaty-wise we are. If something were, so that was the other day, that was a very kind of, I don't want to say scary, but it was a touch and go situation. That missile that landed in Poland, immediately everybody blamed on the Russians. If the Russians were to attack Poland, or to conduct a missile strike or artillery strike against a NATO country, by Article 5 of the NATO Charter, we are bound to respond. An attack on one is an attack on all. So I think putting more troops in Europe not necessarily means we're going to go to war in Ukraine, but it's preparing for any sort of eventuality that if Russia were to expand this war, we would be prepared to respond. Jade asked a really good question. So if the United States were to go to war, for example, with Nigeria, we don't have to be equal in capacity. We have to at least have real capacity to go to war. Hobbes talks about, what makes us enemies isn't the fact that we are equally powerful strength-wise, but we are equally powerful in wit, and that's what makes us enemies. So if we were to go to war against, think about the British invasion of the Falkland Islands in the early 1980s, or even, the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003. There was no way the Iraqi military could stand toe-to-toe with the United States military, but it had the capacity, it had a military capacity. They had arms and munitions and they were trained to use them, which is a difference between, attacking unarmed civilians. Unarmed civilians don't have that capacity or training. So that's it doesn't have to be equally equipped. They just have to have some sort of military capacity. Jordan, I see you have your hand up. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So I hope this question isn't too broad.
That's okay.
You said that our ideas culturally of what is just in war can differ. In terms of, I guess, U.S. and Russian conflict, how do you think our ideas of what is just in war differ, and how does that play a role in all of our conflicts over many years?
That's a great question. So the Russian way of war is different than the American way of war. I know a lot of people are surprised that the Russians have committed so many troops, and that they're dying in such large numbers seems surprising to a lot of people. If you look at Russian military history, that is how the Russians have fought their wars. Think about World War I, the large, conscript, uneducated military just thrown into battle. World War II, when they fought the German invasion in the 1940s, same thing. So the Russians fight their wars differently. The Russians also have no problem bombing civilian targets at all. They do it in Ukraine. They did it in South Ossetia when they fought the war against Georgia in 2008. They did it in Chechnya, in Dagestan in the 1990s. So what they view as acceptable from a moral perspective differs than what we currently would view as morally acceptable. And that's kind of that gray area we talk about. All the great religious groups of the world and all philosophy talks about morality and empathy, but how we apply morality and empathy can sometimes be different, and the Russians view it different than the United States does, and other countries too. Does not make us morally superior, doesn't or anything like that. Just we view how war should be conducted different, and has changed over time in the United States as well. Does that answer your question? Okay, good. Any other questions? Samantha, I see you about containing communism. Not as much today as it has been in our past. We continue to, it's on and off again with Cuba in terms of we clung to the notion for the longest time about not having relationships with Cuba because they're a communist country, to we allow some relations with Cuba, you could fly there on vacation, to maybe we don't. And China's communism is much different than Soviet communism was. So we often talk about the Chinese Communist Party, but we trade with the Chinese. We have really normalized relations with the Chinese. I mean, even if we are in competition. Competition is not necessarily a bad thing. In terms of it breeds innovation, it breeds you to do your best. When it becomes a problem is when it starts to overtake everything you do, that you view everything through the lens of competition. So Katie, I see your hand up. We'll come back around to you. Go ahead.
Sorry, I have one more question.
No, that's why we're here. I'll stay and answer questions all night if you guys want.
Thank you. I was wondering, do you think if someone is trying to fight a just war, that absolves them from prosecution as a war criminal? Like if they think that they're fighting a just war, but they're doing things that we would deem as immoral, do you think that like prevents them from being prosecuted?
No, I don't. So if we're gonna use the Russian example. So the Russians feel they're fighting a just war because they feel they've used denazification of Ukraine, they've used NATO's incursion into Ukraine has threatened, Russia militarily, threatened their borders, threatened Russia's existence. So to Russia, it's a just war. We don't view the invasion of a sovereign country as a just war. It's not an acceptable action. Again, I'll go back to the Germans of the 1930s. They felt invading Czechoslovakia was important to grow the greater Germany. That doesn't mean it's justified. And Germany was rightly punished at the end of the war, even though Germany felt they were conducting a just war. Your actions, even if you are conducting a just war, if you do actions within that war that are unjust, right? So the reason you go to war may be just. Maybe you're defending yourself from an invasion, like the Ukrainians are. But if you conduct actions that are considered, not just within the conduct of the war, you're just as guilty, and you could be tried as a war criminal. So the Ukrainians killing or torturing Russian soldiers, or killing Russian civilians, or using weapons that we would consider banned, you could still be punished rightfully for doing those types of actions, using those type of weapons. Madeline, go ahead. I see you have another question.
Yeah, I feel like all of my questions kind of have a general theme, but
that's okay.
It's more of like an opinionated question on how you see or feel about like innocent people suffering the repercussions of war, because I'm someone that has I have certain beliefs about war and then emotional based beliefs about war. And my question as a professor, of someone who teaches us, is how would you say you feel about innocent people getting hurt by war and how to deal with that?
So I'm going to stick to the U.S. perspective. The United States military goes out of its way to protect innocent civilians. Does that mean sometimes innocent civilians don't get harmed, killed in military actions? Yes. But the United States, and rightly we should do this, even if it means we have to, probably well before any of you were born, the Battle of Fallujah in 2004. The United States Marines surrounded the city of Fallujah in Iraq for several days and then announced that they were going to invade at a certain time. And everybody that wanted to leave the city of Fallujah had the right to leave unmolested. You could leave the city. That announced to our enemies, yes, we're going to invade your terrorist sanctuary, but we wanted to protect civilian lives. Now, we also knew that the terrorists that were in Fallujah were spoiling for a fight, so they weren't going to leave. But we did our best to make sure civilians got out. We do our best to make sure we identify hospitals, schools, all of those things that shouldn't be attacked under the laws of war, that we don't attack them. Even, if it were a military necessity, it would take, to be honest, we run a lot of this by the lawyers. Well, is it legal for us to do something? But we would not, we do our best to minimize civilian suffering, which, even though we haven't signed on to some of those treaties that I mentioned, U.S. hasn't signed on to the landmine treaty, and we haven't signed on to the cluster munition treaty and things like that. But it's our policy to not use those weapons. We just don't want to tie our hands behind our backs. Should we ever choose to, if we go to war with Russia, maybe we might want to start employing landmines again. But I will say, yeah, innocent civilians, they should not have to suffer the consequences of war. The people of Ukraine are suffering enough as it is, for example, just by the fact that the disruption to their daily lives and the paucity of goods and things that they need just to survive on a daily basis, to be targeted militarily is something that they shouldn't have to suffer. Go ahead, Henry.
Hi. The short question is, during a war, is value or interest more important? And to kind of expand on that, it's inspired by a TED Talk by Simon Sinek. I'm not sure if you watched it. If not, I can give a brief summary.
No, go ahead, please give the brief summary.
So yeah, basically he talked about game theory, and the idea is in a game there where there are both a finite player and infinite player. It's always the infinite player who has the upper hand because they have more means, and the opponents know less about them. So so in a war, it's better to be an infinite player, and the ways to focus more on the value instead of the interest. So even if doing something may hurt your short-term interest, but it follows your value, then you should still do it because it will provide a positive image for your country and make your allies have more confidence in you, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, exactly. So do you trade expediency for long-term secure it, right? That kind of actually ties back into Madeline's question just now. You know, the United States could do things that are militarily expedient to achieve our interests, but are they morally, you know, reprehensible to us? So we trade short-term military achievement of our interests for the longer-term greater good of our reputation, our standing with our allies, things that are very difficult to repair once you've damaged them. If you've damaged your standing in the world, it's very, very difficult to regain that standing if you've done something that is considered morally reprehensible or illegal. So yeah, I think there is a very good argument to be made about in terms of balancing military expediency versus the longer term good for our country. And the United States does that. We don't do things that are military expedient. We sometimes trade those for the longer term good. So that's interesting. So Melina, I see you had a question about examples going to war for self-defensive purposes. So all of, you know, from the U.S. perspective, World War II was a defensive purpose. Korea was a defensive purpose to repel the North Korean invasion of South Korea. You could make an argument that even 9/11, the response in Afghanistan, was a defensive purpose. Although we went on the offensive, it was in response to being attacked initially. So those are the examples that always come to mind for me right away. You know, Belgium during World War I fought a defensive war. The British, even the French, they were invaded by the Germans. So those are countries that I think that have kind of fought a war for defensive purposes. Other questions about anything? We don't have to stick to the topic of war. I'm happy to. We can talk about anything else you all would like to talk about. If not, everyone have a great night. I hope to see you here in the fall. Again, if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out, and have a great night.